So thank you all for joining us. My name is Maya Korbik. I am the founder of the Nari Financial Education Academy, whose mission is to provide fun, educational, and interactive tools for parents and caregivers to help them teach children financial literacy. My guest today is Sarah Phillips, the founder of Four Pocket Money Management System for Kids. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Hey Maya, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm so excited too. So I just want to mention that Sarah and I found each other on Instagram, and I really love her Instagram page. And her message is very similar to my message. We were trying to do the same thing, empower parents to teach kids financial literacy. And I'm so excited to have you here today. I feel like there's a lot we can talk about, and hopefully people will find this interview inspirational and learn something new from it.
Absolutely, I hope so. We've seen we're on the same wavelength when it comes to this. Like so many of our posts, we're always commenting back and forth. It's fantastic.
Right. So tell us, how did you start on this journey?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm a mom, three boys, a beautiful blended family. And I think like a lot of parents out there, we hit a point where our kids were constantly asking the question, can you buy me this? Everywhere we went, every store we went to, when you went to a museum, at the gift shop at the end. And we just hit a point where we realized our kids were asking for things, and I don't think they actually wanted it. They just didn't know when that magical yes was going to come, because certainly we weren't saying yes to everything. So it was like, well, I better ask for it, or it might be a missed opportunity. And our kids were just constantly asking. And it was frustrating for us. And our kids weren't really learning anything. They weren't prioritizing their ask. They weren't really thinking about what it was. So my husband and I sat down and we decided, you know what, we need to start teaching our kids about money. We need to empower them to manage their own money, because what was happening is we controlled the money. We got to decide when the yes was. So they felt their only job was to ask. And we realized if we started shifting some of that power and giving them their own money to work with, that kids will spend their own money differently than they will spend yours. So we shifted it over. We developed a system where our kids divided their money, saving, spending, giving, investing, and right away we saw some fantastic proof that we were on the right track. So the example I love is right after we started all this, we went to the movies, and we pay for the tickets to go to the movies, of course, but the kids right away, can we have popcorn? Can we have candy? Can we have treats? And we said, you know what? You have your own money now. You don't need to, you can spend it on that. You don't need to ask us. We're not going to buy it. So the kids ran off. They were so excited, ran off to the concession stand. And then they ran right back again and they said, do you realize how much that costs? Why would I pay that much for candy when I can get the same thing at the dollar store? Now, we've been saying this to them for years. We live close to a movie theater, so we go on occasion. But we've been saying this to them for years. It never sunk in until it was their own money. So we knew at that point we were on the right track, that this was definitely going to serve them and serve them into the future as well.
Right. And, it's so interesting because that's sort of what we discovered as well. When it was our money, they had no problems just, asking. But once we actually gave them some money to manage on their own, it was a whole different story. And same things, like we've had comments like, do you understand how expensive the ice cream truck ice cream is? Or I even had my daughter, what we did with her, or with both of our kids, when we went to Disney World one year, we actually, I was really scared what that was going to look like, because there's so many temptations, right? So we basically gave them some spending money up front, and we were like, you know what, you can spend it right away, or you can spend it at the end of the trip. It's really up to you. But you're not getting more than that. And so they really held on to it, and they didn't beg us. They didn't, bother us. And it was really interesting because my daughter made a comment. I think she was maybe 7 or 8 at the time. And she's like, Mom, this exchange rate to US dollar is so high. And you would think, we normally, I would have never thought about talking, to my daughter about exchange rate at that age, but like she actually understood that. So I totally agree with you. When it's their own money, they treat it completely differently.
Absolutely. I hear that from so many parents. Parents are surprised. They think, oh, my kids are too young. No, I hear it from parents all the time. They're shocked at how quickly that change can happen.
Right. And so when you decided that you're going to give your kids their own money, did you sit down with your husband? Did you guys agree on certain principles or foundations of what was important to you to teach them?
Absolutely. So what we built was something that was first based on cash. We knew we wanted something that was cash based, something the kids could touch, hold, feel. We wanted to make sure that we covered the four areas I mentioned: saving, spending, and giving, which are commonly covered, but also investing. That was an important fourth pillar that we wanted to include when we started teaching our kids. We wanted something that was convenient when we built it. Like I said, we had 3 kids, so if that's 4 areas, we knew jars, having 12 jars, that's a lot of counter space for us, that we didn't want to have something that was big, took up a lot of room. And we also, when we talked about it, we wanted to set ourselves up for success. And we knew where we would struggle the most if we wanted our kids to divide our money across 4 areas was always if we went to the bank machine and took out a $20 bill every allowance day. Now we have this $20 bill that can't be divided amongst the 4 areas. So we knew we wanted to stockpile, I call it our reserve, stockpile the $5 bills, the loonies, the toonies, and have them sitting there ready to go, because we knew without that we would likely slip. As parents, we just will, well, not this week. Well, I'll give you an IOU on paper, or we'd start to move away from what we really intended. So we wanted to make sure that from the beginning we had established a system that covered all of those areas.
No, that's great. And I think it's really important. This is one thing I tell people all the time that, if there are two parents involved, they should be both involved in deciding how to teach kids money, because otherwise, if one parent's saying one thing and the other parent's saying something completely different, it's just not going to work. So how old were your kids when you started teaching them?
So we were looking at I'll work from the youngest up. So the youngest, I would say he was likely around 5 years old. So we too had done Disney when he was 4. So I know it was slightly after, just after we had done Disney for the first time and saying we really need to change this. So he was about 5. The middle one would be about 9, and the oldest would be about 11 at that point in time.
Okay. And so, I mean, your kids are much older now, right? Like what, you have a 19-year-old, right?
Yep, but 19, 16, and 12 at the moment. We're getting into
Right.
birthday season when it all starts changing on me.
And so do you notice, so I'm curious to see, like, I mean, do you notice that your children have gotten better with money over time? How were they with money to begin with? Were they good money managers, or did they need some coaching? Because some kids are naturally born to be good money managers, whereas others are just naturally born to be more of spenders, right?
I think we had a little bit of everything. When you have 3 different kids and then you multiply by the different situations they find themselves in and the growing experience through this all, we had a little bit of everything. So we have one that's a little more focused, and when you give him the rules, he follows the rules, doesn't even think about it. And he was the youngest anyway, so I think it was a little bit easier. He was the youngest. Here's a set of rules. I'm being given money as long as I follow those rules. He was pretty happy with it. Compared to the older one, starting to get closer to the teenage years, starting to have a little more independence, wasn't wanted to have a little more control, didn't want to necessarily follow all of the guidelines that we wanted to put in place. We certainly have some spenders. We have, and I'd say spenders on things, it can be in the eye of the beholder sometimes. In-app purchases are the one thing that I think drive me crazy. And I tried to put it into perspective and say, that is what's important to this generation. And that's why we empower them to manage their own money, right? So they can make the decisions that maybe aren't the decisions I would be making if it was my money to spend. It's the equivalent of, for our grandparents, what was that crazy rock and roll music, right? There's always going to be something that maybe we don't get that the next generation loves. So for in-app purchases, that was one. They were a little heavier on that side, made me a little uncomfortable, but I tried to trust the system that was them making their own decisions. And if they arrived at the conclusion one day that was money that they didn't get back, so be it. But I think with 3 of them, I think we've been through a little bit of every kind of money personality possible.
Right. And I agree with you. I find that my kids have made some purchases that, I personally would have never made. And I the big thing for me is, once I hand that money over to them in form of allowance, it's really there for them to manage. So I try not to meddle. I might try to say, oh, you know what, have you thought of whatever, like a gentle kind of nudge or gentle reminder, but I try to let them make their own decisions. And I usually try to remember too that, maybe just because my son likes video games, for example, and he wants to spend money on video games, to him, that's important. But to me, as you said, like, it's not important. But maybe for him, like, if I spend money on makeup or clothes or whatever, to him, he doesn't care about stuff like that. He would not spend his money on that. So I think the thing about personal finance, and I mean, they're little kids, but this is personal finance. Personal finance is personal, right? We all decide what we want to spend our money on. And I've had my kids tell me, there were some instances where they spent money and they said, you know what, mom, that was really not a, a good purchase. They learned a good lesson from that experience, I think.
And as adults, we've learned that lesson too. I can't sit and berate them because I have made purchases as an adult that maybe 6 months later I say, wow, maybe that wasn't the best use of my money, but we learn from it. And so we're just starting them learning those lessons a little bit younger.
Right, right. And so I know that you are a big fan of getting the kids to start learning about money earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Why do you believe that, starting them early is important?
Sure. So if we start by the premise of why all of this is so important, I'm big on backwards engineering. So we're starting with our kids because we want them to be money smart adults. We hear adults all the time saying, I wish I had started earlier. So I'm a firm believer that we can be the change we want to see in the world. If we wish we had started earlier, we can't go back in time and change for ourselves, but we can raise an entire generation that actually does start earlier. We can give our kids, teach them what we wish we had learned back when we were their age. So this isn't about raising kids that are rich. It's not about materialism. It's really about, I love how Warren Buffett put it, and I think he said this to his kids, was I want to give them enough money that they can do anything, but not so much money that they can do nothing. And I absolutely love that. This isn't about raising kids that are rich enough so that they can sit at home and play video games all day. That's not my goal. I want my kids to be smart about their money. I don't believe money can buy happiness, but I believe that when you're in financially tough situations, it can rob a lot of peace of mind from you. And I do believe that money can buy financial freedom, which can eventually help support a happy lifestyle. So do I want my kids to sit around all day playing video games? No, but I do want them to be able to have choices when they're older. If they want to take their summers off to hang out with their kids, I want them to be in that money position, not tied to a mortgage or debt. That means they don't have that flexibility. If they want to take a job that they love that pays a little less, I want them to be able to do that and find happiness their own way. So I really think it's about that freedom for them.
Right.
So what we're doing as kids, because the money they set aside, and I mentioned investing a moment ago, isn't going to make them rich necessarily, but what we're doing is really building the habits at a young age. So we're starting them young, dividing their money. You're going to put money aside for savings. You're going to give some. You're going to be investing some of that money, and really letting those habits keep moving. Now, some parents, I've heard parents say, can't we wait till they're a bit older? Can't we wait until they're teenagers? And that's really when you start preparing kids to go out into the world. There's a certain amount of truth to that. And I love, like I say, 2 of our kids are now teenagers. I love the teenage years. They are fantastic kids. It can be a very difficult period of time to be teaching kids new things. Naturally, at that age, they're seeking a little bit of independence. They need to be finding their own voice, making some of their own decisions. And I'm trying to put this as diplomatically as possible. Listening to mom and dad's advice isn't always necessarily top of mind for them. So if we want to start building those habits, maybe once we get to the teenage years, it's going to be a little bit harder. So my best story, I'll just add one little quick story on this. Our oldest one, as he started going into the teenage years, he came to us and he said, look, you guys have done great. You've taught me all this money stuff. He said, but I'm good. He said, you don't need to make me save money anymore. I know how to save. And to a certain extent, he was right. He knows how. I think we all know how. Saving means not spending the money, holding on to it. But it's not just the knowledge, it was the habit that he hadn't yet developed. So we had to kind of take that step back and coach him through. The reason we're doing this isn't just to teach you how to save, but give you that experience, the give you some of the saving wins so that it becomes ingrained naturally as you get older. So really that's why we're starting with our kids, teaching them young when it's a fun topic for them, when they feel important, when they're maybe a little more inclined to listen to some of our parental advice that we've learned over the years.
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, when I hear you talk, I'm like, you're just speaking everything I teach. I'm like, this is so wonderful because that's exactly my thought process, my husband's thought process. We've been doing this for so many years. And the big thing about saving, as you said, everybody knows that saving is important, but I'm really big on trying to teach pay yourself first approach, right? Where we put some money aside right away. And I've been doing that with my kids. My daughter was, I think, 4 or 5 when she first started learning about money. My son was a little bit older, but that was the big thing for me. I wanted them to get into this habit of saving first as soon as they get some money, whether it's like they've earned it or they get it from the allowance or it's a gift from grandparents or whatever. You put some money aside and this becomes a habit that it's ingrained in them, that they cannot go out there and just blow all their money. Like they have to save some of it because it's just part of their DNA. Like that's just the best way for me to explain it. And you know what you said about Warren Buffett. Actually, I think that quote it's so funny that you actually quoted that quote because that's one of my favorite quotes. I quote it all the time. It's actually I've seen it in the movie Descendants, so I don't know if they got it from Warren Buffett, but George Clooney's in that movie and he plays this wealthy man, and he basically said the same thing. He's like, you know, it's like how much do you give your kids? Like you don't want to give them too much so they just be, you know, they're couch potatoes playing video games, but you want to give them enough so they actually do something with that money. And I think it's really important to empower our kids now because the stakes are low and dollar amounts are low. So even if they make a bad financial decision, it doesn't really matter, right? Like they'll learn from it, and that's the best thing that can happen. It's just that they gain that experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know you're big on cash. Do you want to tell us, why being cash based is important to you?
So, so I'll start with why cash, and then I'll take on some of the arguments I hear about why not cash. So for us, it was important that kids, especially younger kids, could see that money was an actual thing. They're growing up in a society where we go to the store, we swipe, we tap. They don't understand when you're saying no at the store. When they ask for something, you say, no, we don't have the money. And if you put yourself in their shoes, why can't you just carry it out and tap that card that you have? Like the idea that that links to a bank account that has your virtual money sitting in there and then that transfers to another account, that's a really hard concept for kids to understand. So if we give them cash, they can count it, they can take it to the store, they can exchange it, they can see that what you're actually doing when you buy something, there's an actual exchange of the money for the thing that you're buying. And we felt that was important for them to understand the basic of what money is before you start layering all these other lessons on top of that. Now, I do hear parents say, cash is so out of date. Our kids are never going to use cash growing up. I never use cash anymore. I think when we look at why we're using cash, so that kids can understand the idea of money. Any system we teach our kids right now, the way technology is evolving, it's going to be out of date. So if you think instead of teaching your kids with cash, it's better to teach them with a card, chances are by the time they're adults, there's not going to be cards anymore. Nowadays, they're swiping their phone. Who knows what it's going to be 10 years from now, the way technology is evolving. Anything we teach our kids, the actual logistics of the transfer, it's going to be out of date by the time they're an adult. So let's back it up and say what's really going to give them the foundation, the best understanding of what money is and what is happening when you're buying something. And that's really going back to something that they can touch, they can count, they can physically see. And so that's why we started with a cash-based system with our kids.
Yeah, and so for us, we did the same thing. We actually originally started with the cash, and we would go to the bank and we would get rolls of coins just to have them on hand, as you said, because when we gave out allowance, we wanted to make sure that we had enough. And we didn't want to be doing IOUs or anything like that. And I think, and I don't know if you know this about me, but I've also been going to schools for the past 8 years, and I've been teaching in schools. And that is one thing for sure that I can attest to, is that children that are in grade 2 and below have a very difficult time understanding how the money is connected between the bank account and that debit card, right? Like a lot of them think that just because their parents have a debit card, and of course they don't understand the difference between the credit card and the debit card. So a lot of these things, right? And what has happened is that I ended up designing some games where it's actually visual and they can see this, but it's very difficult, I think, to teach younger kids cashless money system. Like it's just, I think it's easier now, obviously, once they understand those basics, but when they're that young, it's very difficult for them to comprehend that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I just want to pause here, I guess, and if you can tell us a little bit about your product, because you talked about, the different envelopes and jars. And I know you said you have 3 kids. You didn't want to have all these jars on your counter. So tell us what you designed and how that worked for you and your family, and how it can work for somebody else.
Fantastic. So what we have is, it's called the 4-pocket allowance. Oops, sorry, there we go. It's essentially a book. Fits on your bookshelf, convenient. When you open it up, inside are, I'll say actually 5 pockets, and I'll get to the 5th in a moment. But you're going to see the 4 pockets that we talked about. So there's a spending, an investing, a giving, and a savings that all fit inside. They're clear, so again, kids can see their money as they're putting their money in whether you do weekly, bi-weekly, putting their money in, they can see it growing. So again, we're tapping into that visual understanding. And then I also included, that I mentioned at the beginning, a 5th extra pocket called a reserve. And that's for us to stockpile our 5s, our loonies, our toonies, so that we're all ready come allowance day, that we're not trying to break the $20 bill on a perpetual cycle and falling off of the wagon. So this really, it brought together all those aspects that I talked about earlier. It was convenient, fit on the shelf, it covered the 4 pillars, it had a reserve to it, and was cash based. So that's the product actually that we have available if anyone's ever interested. Yeah.
Amazing. And so how did it work in your family with the, like, for example, the saving portion of it? Did you, your children would just save in there for a particular item? Like how did that work for you guys?
We tried to, I like things to be as visual as possible for kids. So we actually had our kids write down what their particular savings goal was. And that was actually a really interesting process to go through. So in the early days, they set their savings goal. They have a particular thing they're saving towards. We have the little traditional thermometer that we color in how close that we're getting every allowance. We did give them some flexibility. So 10% had to go into giving, 10% went into investing. And then they could choose a bit the divide between spending and saving. It couldn't all go into spending. They did have to work on their savings goal. But our little one, and like I say, he's the pretty rigid one out of the 3. He actually wanted to take all his money and keep putting it into savings. I'm not going to go to the store and buy anything, because he wanted to get as close to his goal as possible, as quickly as possible. So they had some flex between spending and savings, what they could do with that money. What was really interesting, after we went through a couple cycles of saving for a particular item and getting that item, was the kids started saving, and they said, you know what, there's not something in particular I want to save for right now. So I'm just going to save, so that when I do want something, I don't have to wait months to save the money to have it. And I thought that was so fantastic, that already at this young age, they're saying, you know what, rather than always being targeted on getting something else, I now have this security that says I can save for anything that I want. So there wasn't this urgency to have something in particular in mind. I'm just going to save my money and I'll see a few months from now if there's something in particular that catches my eye. So really we find nowadays quite often our kids don't have a specific goal in mind. They're just saving that money there for a rainy day. And then when they find that magical thing, that's the one, they have the money already saved up to buy it.
That's perfect. So they're prepared.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about investing? Do you have an investment envelope in your book?
Yep. So investing is one of those four pillars that was very important for us. And the reason is we can teach our kids to save, but saving in our mindset when we talked about it is really delayed spending. So they have a goal in mind. It's still money that you are going to and take to the store and give away, use to purchase something. And we really wanted to ingrain in our kids that there's some money that you're going to set aside that isn't intended to be touched in the long term. That actually, once we have enough there, you can actually grow to make more money. And that's a later lesson. That wasn't when he was 5 years old. We weren't talking about growing it. But we wanted to get into that pattern that all money isn't current spending versus delayed spending, because savings is so important. What savings teaches kids is how to wait until you have enough money to buy it, which is really going to work towards countering debt when they're older, right? That's where we get into trouble, when we don't want to wait, it's instant gratification. That's when we buy something when we don't yet have the money. So by teaching our kids to save, we're avoiding debt. By teaching kids to invest, by teaching them to take money to set aside that's going to grow and eventually be working for you, that's really setting our kids up for future wealth. And I think that's an important distinction to make. They're targeting two different things. They're both very important lessons. One's not more important than the other, but they do set our kids up for different things in their future. So investing absolutely is an important pillar for us.
And how do you teach investing in your house? What do you do?
So and this comes down to a very personal thing. My husband and I actually geek out on money topics a lot. So we are very comfortable in the stock market. I'm always hesitant to say that. I don't want parents to think if you're not comfortable with certain types of investing, if you're not managing your own investments, then you can't be teaching your kids about it. I absolutely think you can. This just happens to be an area that's near and dear to my heart. I really enjoy it. So stock investing is a lot of what we do and what we try to get our kids involved in. So we've been setting their money aside over the years. They've actually contributed sometimes extra money. We're showing them how it grows. And what's fantastic is, I think it was last year we were away on holidays, and we try to use when we have days off to show the kids the stock market, because usually it's only open on days that they're at school, and so it's hard to do things live with them and show them how things work. And so I did a couple things with my son. This was over the Christmas holidays, and he looked at me and he said, "Mom, could this be somebody's job? Like, instead of going to work, could you just make your money investing?" And you could just see the little wheels spinning in his head, piecing this new information together. And I said, well, you know what, like, so yes, when you have to take a lot of time to really learn it, like there's risks involved, and we talk about the risks all the time, and you have to have money to start with. Like, you have to have a certain amount of money there before it's going to make significant money. But absolutely, that's what your target is for later in life, is to have enough money saved so that you can live off of the money that can generate. And you could just see the wheels spinning in his head. And I think it's fantastic. And I'm so excited to see where that he takes that in the future.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think a lot of people, at least I've had a lot of parents reach out to me and say, you know what, I don't know anything about investing. I do have some investments, but I have somebody else manage them for me. So I don't feel comfortable talking to my kids about investing. And one thing that I usually tell them is, I mean, if they're interested, then, and a lot of these people are actually interested. That's number one reason why they're reaching out to me. But I'm like, this is a great opportunity for you to learn alongside your child. Like, you can actually learn together. And there are great books out there. One of them is J.J. Wenrich's raising, I forget, I actually have it here, teaching kids to buy stocks. Yeah. It's a great book. And I even did an interview with him, and I've recommended it to many other parents. But I really think that, as you said, there is a distinction between, saving money so that we can spend it later on because we're still spending it, and then saving money for like future wealth, which would be investing. So I think we need to teach our children both.
Absolutely. And a great way to get get started, if you're not comfortable necessarily taking the money and showing them the bank, a great way to start this conversation is to play a game of Monopoly. And Monopoly is so fantastic because what you can say to your kids about halfway through is, if I just passed go, if I just kept circling the board and collecting my, I'll call it salary every time you pass go, if I just circle the board and collect the, I can't remember if it's $200. We have one of the specialty versions, and so I think my money is off on it. But if I just collect my salary and don't do anything with that money, am I ever going to get ahead in this game? Because my bills keep growing. I land on other people's properties. I owe things. I don't own anything that's making money. And that's really what investing is all about. It's about taking the money you have, and instead of holding on to it, using it to buy things that generate more money. And I think Monopoly is a fantastic example of that. And just ask kids why they don't just circle the board doing nothing, because you know that's not going to grow your money. And if anything, it's going to diminish your money and you're not going to get ahead. So I think that's a real easy way to start the conversation. These don't all have to be serious conversations, lecture style, sitting down with our kids. I think there's so many fun ways that we can start to introduce money that are very natural.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I have a question for you about allowance. What allowance method are you doing with your children? Are you doing chores based or no chores or a mixed approach?
I love this. I find it's this is like the hot button topic when it comes to allowances. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think as parents in general, we need to get off of all the mom shaming and saying that there's one way that you can do things. The easy answer is do what's right for your family. But I'm happy to share what we decided to do. So we did decide to give our kids an allowance, and we don't see it as money for nothing. What we do is see that as the money we would have probably spent on them anyways. So pre-allowance days, yes, we said no 99% of the time, but there was still that 1% where you're in the museum gift shop, really interesting educational toy. Great, that might be a yes. So we're still spending money once in a while. And so we're just shifting the power when it came to that. So we decided we're going to take that money and give it to them, but give it to them in a lump sum. Let them decide how that money is going to get divvied up. And we're very strict on that. Because you get an allowance, we're not buying things for you when you're at the store. Like, that's just, we had to cut it off, and we had to make sure there wasn't a slippage that way, because that would really undermine what we were trying to do. For us, chores, they're day-to-day chores, emptying the dishwasher, cleaning the rooms. Those things we felt strongly are things that you have to do as part of this household. You're dirtying the dishes with us. You are going to help clean the dishes, empty the dishwasher, tidy up around here, do your laundry, because that's part of being a member of this family. And you don't get paid for that. As soon as you start paying for certain chores, it starts to send the signal that maybe they're optional, that maybe, well, if you don't need money this month, you can just skip out on your chores. And that's not really the case. Those are things that have to be done. So we didn't want to tie it to chores, but we did introduce a commission system on top of it. So we did say, if you're saving for something large, there might be additional jobs around the house that normally wouldn't fall to you that we can introduce to you. And I think we just actually went through this on a post the other day. I commented on one of your posts that what we did, one example of what we did was I had one of our kids scan all of our paper photos for us, because we had all those photo books, and he wanted a little bit of extra money saving for, this goes back a few years, I think it was a video game in particular. So we said, well, great, if you want to sit for however many hours and scan the 800 photos that we have in this stack, we'll give you a certain amount of money for that. So we do try to find things that are beneficial to us, that aren't just acts of doing something that aren't really contributing. So things that are useful for us, and get them helping. And I think they learn extra skills around that. They've learned how to scan, they learn new computer skills. I get him helping out with some of my social media things these days. So we do introduce a commission system when they want to top up what their savings in particular.
Right. And we try to do the same. We actually have the same kind of approach as well. That's how I'm like, oh my gosh, you're speaking my language. It's the same kind of thing. We do, if our children want extra money, there are some things that they can do that we would typically pay somebody else. Like, I have a lot of paper confidential documents that, I have this tiny little shredder. It takes forever to shred documents, but otherwise I'd have to take it to Staples Business Depot or whatever to have it shredded, and I would have to pay them. So you know what, instead I can pay my kids. And then, but you know, the scanning of the photos is such a great idea. I think I mentioned, I think I want my children to do that in the summer, because I know we did something similar a couple of years ago with Costco, and they charge a pretty penny for that. It's
Yeah,
really, really expensive service. So I would rather pay my children than pay Costco to do it for me. Um,
absolutely. They
yeah.
could even use it as a business going forward. Neither of my kids, or none of three, I'm not sure the right word, not neither. None of my kids wanted to take that on as a business going forward, but absolutely they could. If you see what kind of work it is, it's not too hard to do. If it's something your parents need, chances are there's lots of people out there. And then you start to instill that entrepreneurial spirit on top of it.
Yeah, speaking of entrepreneurial spirit, like, do you try to instill that in your kids? Like, how is that going? Is that important to you guys at all, or no?
So it is, as someone who's running a bit of a business, it is important to us, but we also, I think sometimes we try to take that step back and say each child gets to do what they want and we have to listen to them. Everyone is different. We can't force it on them, but we are always trying to show them different opportunities. And I think this generation in particular, I love the saying, we're preparing our kids for jobs that don't currently exist. And we see how business models are evolving. We see how the gig economy is emerging, which I think there's a lot of challenges out there, but I think the opportunities for doing something, even if you have a 9 to 5 job and you're doing something on the side, I think there's so many opportunities to market whatever extra skill set you may have. And we really try to instill that in our kids, that yes, you may still have a career that you choose to pursue, but you can diversify your income in so many different ways, and getting them to think a little bit creatively and encourage them, but not push them. We don't want to push them so hard that it turns them off of the idea and they start tuning it out. So it is something we talk about a lot. And at this point, we have some that are aspiring YouTubers. Of course, I think a lot of parents can resonate with that notion, who would love to build a YouTube empire someday, and they're working slowly at that, and that's great. Work away towards something, see what you can do with it, and we'll just see where that leads them in the future.
Right. And how do you, do you treat or do you teach money management to your children differently because you have such a variety of ages? I mean, you have 19-year-old and then, you know, you have younger kids. That does your method and does your approach change as they get older?
So absolutely. First, there's the amount of money. So we did start out very much everyone getting an equal amount, even though they were slightly different ages. And I had read a fantastic idea along the way that instead of us increasing their allowance, whenever they came to us and felt that maybe time had elapsed, that the amount we were giving them was too insignificant, it was up to them to build a business case. So why persuade us? I'm not saying yes or no. I need you to persuade me why that's a good idea. So certainly the amount is something to take into consideration. We also try to empower them to manage their own budgets in some way. So clothing is a great example where they have to inventory, getting into the fall time, back to school. What clothes do you have? What do you need? We agree on a set amount, and then really it's up to them to manage that money to cover the things that they need. And if that means that they want to buy a particular expensive shirt with a brand name on it, but that means you're wearing dollar store socks, that's your choice. You pick and choose how you want to allocate that money. We try to guide them on what good money choices are and how they can allocate that. But we know they're getting into those years where brand names are more important, certain things that they're looking for. If they want to contribute their own money, they can, but helping them to manage budgets in and of themselves. We've also moved, we used to do our allowances every 2 weeks, so on a biweekly basis. And we've actually shifted to a quarterly allowance, which was a recommendation of a friend of mine who, like us, felt she was always getting up the $20 bills and breaking them and stockpiling loonies and toonies. And then she said, you know what, I'm just going to give them their allowance every 3 months. And they have to learn how to manage that money. It's a little harder for younger kids, but as they get older, it's a great way to say, look, yes, this looks like a lot of money, but if you run out tomorrow and spend it all, that means for the next 3 months, you're not going to have any more money coming in unless you take on an extra commission job. along the way. So getting them to think about really managing some of that money to a greater degree. And we've shifted a little bit from just being in cash to using bank cards, which is the reality. I must say, when you have a teenager and the first day he's running late for school and all of a sudden Uber shows up in your driveway and you didn't even know your teenager could order an Uber with their own money, it's a little bit of a shock as a parent. He's a very resourceful child. So yeah, so moving on to bank cards is just the reality for them, and I think they're gonna pick that up a lot faster than we guessed.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. So you had Uber pull up to your car and you're like, I didn't even know him he could do
I know.
stuff like this.
I know. We said, "Aren't you running late for school? You have to get walking." And he called an Uber and got Ubered to school that day. And if that's what he felt was a good use of his money, that's his lesson. Like you're talking about making mistakes. That's what he felt was a good lesson.
Right. And so that's just it. I think, we have to let them make those mistakes if it's a mistake. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
it was the right way to use the money. He made it to school on time. So maybe he
Yeah.
didn't want to spend that money on something else. How are you finding? I'm just curious because of COVID. I have a teenager as well, but I find that because of COVID, we're stuck at home. We're in the lockdown right now. So, they can't really go anywhere. They can't spend their money on anything. And for us, I mean, we used to do allowance once a week, but because we've been in this lockdown, it's kind of like they're not really spending their money on anything other than perhaps video games. And so now we're doing allowance quarterly, but I think for us, it's just by accident, not really because we meant to do it that way. How are you finding it? Are your kids spending any money right now, or are they just holding on to it, or what's going on with you?
I think we're in a very similar boat to you. There's still a lot of video game buying on the side. The in-app purchases I talked about. I think Roblox, I think, is going to be going public soon. And I'm like, I should be investing in that stock because I do feel like significant allowance money from our house filters into Roblox.
You want to
That's not
get
me
some of
making a
that
stock
back.
recommendation,
I know,
just
I
sorry.
know.
So I find we're in that way. Our middle one went through a long period where he would ask almost daily to take him through a drive-through. He wanted to get something, he's at that age where he can have a bit of coffee. He calls it coffee. I think it's really chocolate milk with a little bit of coffee in it. It's a little heavier on the sugar. But we use that as teaching lessons as well, right? Like you can look how much that is and we have all those same ingredients sitting in our house. We make some coffee, you can chill it in the fridge and you can add a little bit of your milk and your chocolate syrup and you can make your own drink and it's costing you pennies on the dollar. So we try to take that extra time, but we're in the same boat, not a lot of spending at this point in time. Great opportunities to save, great opportunities so that down the road when they do want something, they'll have saved that much more on it. But yeah, COVID's definitely been a step back and we share our own experiences. I think as adults, it's been the same thing. It's been the time for some of our spending to slow down a little bit, that we could redirect some of our money. And we talk to our kids about that. We talk to them about our experience and how we're trying to use this opportunity with our own finances so that they can see it's not just a kid's thing. This is an adult thing too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how do you teach donating or giving in your house? And I know I've seen your posts, so I know that you guys teach that. And why is that important to you?
Oh, so giving, there's so many things we can say about giving. I think first it goes back to that question about cash that we were talking about earlier. If you remember when we were kids, do you remember coming home from school and we'd have those big envelopes when there was a fundraiser and we'd walk door to door to all our neighbors and they'd write their name and you'd put the cash in the envelope and carry it back. I started to realize our kids don't see that anymore. They come home with the sheet that talks about there's a fundraiser, and after they go to bed, I log in, create the little account, donate money out of my own account, and let them know in the morning I made a donation on your behalf. And they say, okay, that's nice. And then they go into school and maybe it's talked about a little bit how close they're getting to a classroom goal, but they're not seeing this idea that you're taking something of yours and giving it to help other people. And so I think it's so important that we make that real for them and make them understand that sharing isn't just something that we teach little kids with their toys, but as adults, sharing really shifts into something else. And there's ways that we can share our own benefits and our own good fortune to help our community and help others out in the world. So we try to focus on, we do use part of our giving money for gift giving, but we do use part of it for charity giving as well. With kids, I find it's really useful to find some of those, I'll use the term living gifts, something that's very tangible for them to understand what their money is doing. You're giving this much money, you are buying 3 mosquito nets for people living in a potentially malaria infested area, or you are buying a goat to give to a family that's going to give milk, and they can see, here's why I'm giving, here's the tangible benefit coming from my money being shared. Because if we leave it, some organizations, it's hard for kids to understand. And I think they're all fantastic organizations, but if you're giving to an area that's going into research, but you don't know that it's actually going to find a cure, it's hard for kids to understand really what their money is doing in that organization. As they get older, absolutely. But those living gifts, I think, make it a little more real. Our family, a few weeks ago, just after Christmas, we adopted a lemur. It was something that was very tangible for us. So there's a local animal, they call them, they have the name zoo, but they're not truly a zoo, and they support all kinds of animal initiatives in Canada. And they had an adoption program. So we've adopted a lemur, and that's something very tangible that our kids can understand that their money is going towards.
Oh, that's nice. That's very nice. Yeah. I think with kids, that's the big thing, is just making all these things very visible to the eye, tangible, so that they understand. When it comes to money, especially when they're young, they have to see where the money is going and how the money is flowing. And as you said, like when they get older, then, we can shift to these less visible ways of spending money or donating money. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us today. I'm going to end this interview. And before we finish, can you just tell us where people can find you and where they can get your product?
Absolutely. So we'd love to have you join us for all the fun over on Instagram. I'm at the Money Mindset Mom, so 3 M words there. So feel free to pop over. We're talking constantly about all things about kids, money, even how it affects family finances overall. For our product, the 4-Pocket Allowance kit that I showed earlier, those you can find at www.4pocketallowance.com. So feel free to check that out as well. And thank you, Maya, so much for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've had so much fun.
Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you, coming on and doing this interview. And I really actually had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Great.